This was the only way a ship in distress could communicate before Marconi came on the scene in the late 19th century. Deep silence reigned on the airwaves. The only way to summon urgent assistance was by cable, but the cable was on the seabed, physically connected to the telegraph exchanges. Messages were transmitted by Morse code. In Morse, each letter is represented by a combination of dots and dashes, long and short electrical impulses. But within a few years, cable had a serious rival. The ancient university city of Bologna in Italy likes to boast of her highly charged atmosphere, just the place for inventors like Marconi, her most famous son. Even today, radio operators are known in Italy as Marconisti. From an early age, Marconi was fascinated by electricity. Working with leading researchers, he carefully built up the knowledge he needed for his inventions. He could never have done this with a conventional college education. His Irish mother brought her children up to speak English as well as Italian, and they were a musical family too. Guglielmo played the piano. While on holiday at the age of 20, he read an article on the experiments carried out by the German physicist Heinrich Hertz. This gave him a clear goal to aim at: the transmission of messages by means of electromagnetic waves. A spark jumps across the gap between two live wires. It emits electromagnetic radiation. This causes a second spark in the receiver. The radiation spreads out in all directions, like light waves. This phenomenon was at the heart of Hertz's research. At the same time, Alexander Popov in Russia was performing experiments on atmospheric electricity. He developed the rod antenna for use in his thunderstorm warning device. In France, Edouard Branly invented the coherer, a more efficient form of receiver. It consists of iron filings in a tube. They cohere when a signal is received, thus closing an electrical circuit. Marconi installed a tapper in this device to shake the filings apart again, preparing them for the next signal. With his goal now clear, Marconi worked like a man possessed at the top of his parents' villa. His father thought it all a lot of nonsense, a waste of time, but his mother believed in him and even brought his meals to the laboratory. After 2 years, he managed to get an electric bell to ring from a distance of 9 meters, and using a metal sheet antenna, succeeded in transmitting Morse code signals. The metal sheet was soon replaced by a wire antenna, which he set up in the garden. This enabled him to transmit across greater distances using longer wavelengths. When he discovered the principle of grounding or earthing, the range jumped to several hundred meters at a stroke. Now, for the first time, he tried to transmit beyond the range of visibility. His brother took a rifle. He was to fire it if he received the signal. An assistant carried the receiver. Off they went, 2.5 kilometers. On the table was his well-tried equipment: the Morse key, the balls for the spark gap, the induction coil, the battery. He was the first to use the same antenna for both transmission and reception. He tapped out 3 short impulses with the Morse key. They caused 3 sparks to jump, producing the electromagnetic waves.
Incredibile! Funziona! Mamma mia! Oh!
The proud result? His signals went through forests, walls, fog, night, and over mountains and across seas. The electric current causes the electrons in the antenna to vibrate. They generate the radio wave. But in Marconi's early days, no one knew about electrons. Italy showed little interest in the invention, so Marconi went to Britain. With its enormous navy, Britain might be able to make good use of wireless transmission, he thought. The post office engineers, though sceptical, gave him support. Using antennas suspended from flying kites, Marconi soon achieved a range of 15 kilometers over water and sent the first wireless telegrams. The King of Italy suddenly woke up and sent for the 24-year-old King of the Airwaves. A number of Italian warships were equipped with his apparatus. The frequency spectrum was still very broad, but it was adequate for summoning assistance, for example. Word spread that ships with Marconi equipment were safer. The most urgent problem was to find a way of filtering the actual message out of a jumble of waves. Steady improvements in the receivers, allowing accurate tuning, enabled transmitters and receivers to function more reliably. Alongside the equipment, Marconi also hired out the radio operator, an entirely new trade. He imposed one condition: messages could only be sent to his stations, an effective monopoly. Altogether, Marconi held 800 wireless telegraphy patents. Radio was first used in crime detection when wife murderer Dr. Crippen was arrested on a steamer on his way to America. The wireless signal had got there first. When the Titanic sank, 700 passengers owed their lives to the SOS message broadcast by the ship's radio operator. After this disaster, emergency frequencies were agreed worldwide. Cartoonists showed Marconi bartering for souls with King Neptune. 11 years earlier, Marconi had secretly prepared his attempt to bridge the Atlantic. At Poldhu, on the coast of southwest England, he built the biggest transmitting station yet seen. It took a year to complete, but he told no one what he planned. The antennas were damaged by winter storms, but at 12:30 one December day in 1901, he reported the weak reception of signals from 3,200 kilometers across the Atlantic.
Alle 12:30, ecco giungere al mio orecchio debolmente i segnali che venivano lanciati nello spazio dalla stazione di Poldhu sull'altra sponda dell'oceano.
His diary listed only the frequencies and, hardly legible, the times of reception. The sober record of a sensational feat by which he proved those scientists wrong who maintained that the radio waves would go off into space in a straight line. But long waves, with a wavelength of between 1,000 and 10,000 meters, go no higher than the ionosphere. The Earth's conductivity means they follow the curvature of the globe. A few years earlier, Marconi had been the victim of industrial espionage in England. The spy was the German physicist Professor Slaby, on the right. He'd already conducted experiments of his own with radio waves, as had Professor Carl Braun, who invented a new transmitter system. He shared the 1909 Nobel Prize for Physics with Marconi. But it took Kaiser Wilhelm to coordinate the German national effort. He wanted to break Marconi's monopoly, and at his bidding, the Telefunken company was set up. Telefunken was another success story. The Germans demanded the opening up of the airwaves on all frequencies, a goal they achieved at international conferences on the subject. The German broadcasting station at Nauen was for a short while the biggest in the world. Installations like this one from the 1930s were well suited to radio transmissions. Unlike Morse signals, speech and music transmissions involve complicated waveforms, and these must somehow be added to the basic carrier wave. The prerequisite for this modulation, as it's called, was the invention of the diode, and soon afterwards the triode. Both have now largely been replaced by transistors. The first description of the diode is due to an Englishman, Professor Sir John Fleming. He wanted to make radio signals visible, as he was hard of hearing. By chance, he hit upon the principle of rectification and amplification. Marconi seized upon these valves at once. He was one of the founders of the BBC. Here's an extract from the first broadcast with the singer Dame Nellie Melba. When Vatican Radio was inaugurated, the Pope asked Marconi how it worked. He replied, "Your Holiness must have a better idea than I. You are nearer to God. I don't know the answer." With the help of God, who's placed such mysterious forces at the disposal of mankind, I've been able to construct a transmitter which will carry the voice of the Holy Father to every part of the world. His yacht, Elettra, was Marconi's favourite resort in his later days. He'd converted it into a floating laboratory, where he tirelessly investigated the principles of radar, and above all, shortwaves, with their inexplicably long ranges. He had no way of knowing that those waves that propagate upwards are partly reflected by the ionosphere. The ionosphere is an electrically charged layer of the atmosphere ranging from 1 to 400 kilometres above the Earth. It reflects waves with a wavelength of between 10 to 100 metres. Between the ground waves and the reflected waves, there's mostly a dead zone. In certain circumstances, short waves are sometimes reflected within the ionosphere. If so, they can be sent all round the world without much weakening of the signal. 7 times round in a second, at the speed of light and in all directions. And so Marconi's vision of a worldwide radio network has come true. Marconi was the very embodiment of the kind of researcher whose ideal is to dominate nature for the benefit of humanity. He was totally non-political, with an eye only for the practicalities. That was his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. When he died, all the radio stations in the world kept 2 minutes silence. For this brief moment, the airwaves were as still as before he appeared on the scene. A good 10 years later, the foundations of modern electronics were laid with the discovery of the transistor. The last really tangible process, the spark, has long since disappeared from radio technology. Satellite communications mean that every ship anywhere in the world is accessible by radio, not to mention their role in a host of other services. The extremely short waves used by radar, with a wavelength of just a centimetre or so, reflect metallic objects so accurately that their distance and direction can be established precisely. This helps to prevent collisions in fog or darkness. Long and medium waves are gradually being abandoned. For music broadcasts in particular, VHF, very high frequency, is taking over. Short waves are chiefly the domain of the amateur. This worldwide communications network has enabled us to think on a global scale. It's the foundation of international trade and international markets. But this flood of information has its darker side. There's no guarantee of truth, and there's the threat that it may be just as destructive as other kinds of flood. Alongside satellite communications, the future belongs to directional radio. Microwaves concentrated by parabolic mirrors, the ether's own cable.